Get on with the agenda. Let me introduce our lovely panel here. I'm going to introduce them. They're going to raise their hand, let you know who they are. Their names are posted up there, but I can't read. And then I will show a very short 10-minute clip of the most recent PBS special on beetle infestation here in Montana. It has been aired a number of times on PBS, and I'm just going to show you a short little 10-minute. It's going to give you a flavor of all the key and hot issues dealing with this. And then we're going to really engage with our panel of experts. Let me introduce, and if you wouldn't mind either standing or raising your hand, Paul Matter is a district ranger here at Lowell National Forest. He is our new district ranger. How long have you been here, Paul, now?
Mid-June.
Mid-June. Wow. Kenneth Gibson, our entomologist with the Forest Health Protection section. John Wayberg, he's a fire management officer here at the Missoula Ranger District.
Correct. Work for Paul.
Pardon me?
I work for Paul.
Work for Paul, yes. Okay. Jack Cohen, he is with Fire Lab Research Physical Scientist. Amy Gannon, and you're going to see her on the video. She is a star. State entomologist. Eric Norris, Service Forestry Specialist. Lyron Bonney is our community forester. Bill Caldwell is Assistant Chief, the Missoula Rural Fire District. Morgan Valiant is a Conservation Lands Manager for Parks, Missoula Parks and Rec. And I'm so glad you're here because Mount Jumbo has come up so many times.
Oh, good.
Tamarack Forestry Services, Dan Scherg is here. And he knows how to remove these dead and infested trees. So we have a real panel of experts from the beginning of the entomologist knowing about the little creature to tree removal, so, and everything else to do with that. So with no further ado, I am going to go ahead and start this little video just for 10 minutes. And I'm thinking you're going to be able to hear it just fine. If you can't, I will increase the volume for you back there. I don't know that we need to turn the lights down either, but we'll see.
The latest infestation by the mountain pine beetle in Montana has triggered a debate about the impact of global warming on the forest ecosystem.
Well, the pine beetle kill is a long-term natural cycle. The insects are multiplying rapidly right now, in part, we think, because of climate change. Temperatures are rising. The cold periods during the winter are not as long or as severe as they used to be. That allows the insects to survive at a higher elevation and a more northern elevation. And so they're infesting our pine forest at a very rapid rate. Around the world, we've seen about a 0.7 degree rise in temperature, and that translates into fewer days in which the temperature drops below 10 below in our forest, and that allows the beetles to spread more rapidly than ordinarily.
What kind of an effect is climate change having on not only the forests we see today, and the ability of the mountain pine beetle, for example, to produce multiple flights a year and to overwinter into the trees, whereas historically cold temperatures would have killed them. What impact is climate change going to have on the forests we have today, as well as the forests that our grandkids are going to be living in and enjoying?
Obviously, there's probably a relation between climate change and the susceptibility of the trees to infestation, and typically the more stress they're under, the more likely they are to be subject to infestation. But the last couple of years has been relatively cool and relatively wet, and yet this last year has been one of the most dramatic increases in infestation. That could be due to the previous years of drought, but certainly you can't make a good correlation between climate change, drought, and what's happened this year.
Mountain pine beetle doesn't really have a preference for if it's in an urban or a rural area. So typically they'll come and go right through a town, and it's very visual. A lot of the residents, it's a more public, noticeable thing when it becomes close to the urban areas.
One of the factors with urban forests or urban pine trees is that they have a much higher value on a per tree basis compared to, say, the commercial value of a tree in a forest. They'll have a high degree of aesthetic value, as well as you know, a significant monetary value to these urban pine trees.
Urban foresters throughout the state stress the importance of detecting beetle-infested trees and learning how to deal with them.
We just always recommend and highly suggest for the public to come to their, their city forester or to any agency that's nearby, a local agency, and talk to them about the issue, and to come out to their property, take a look at what's going on, recognize the signs and symptoms, and possibly, prevent this from happening in their own backyard.
What we want to do is find the trees that are currently infested with bark beetles. And you go up to the base of it, and you'll see that there are pitch tubes. These are what we call pitch tubes. They look like little wads of popcorn. And then also down around the base of the tree, there's boring dust. And then to confirm that it is mountain pine beetle that did hit this tree, we're going to cut into it with a sharp hatchet. And so you find a nice pitch tube, and then you cut above the pitch tube, because the beetles will actually bore into the tree, and then they make galleries going upwards. So what we want to do is expose that gallery. And really, bark beetles all look quite a bit alike, just to the casual observation. What is distinct about them is the galleries they make. This is where the beetles entered, right in here, and then the adults make what's called a parental gallery, going upwards. And then down here you can see actually there's another parental gallery, and off that parental gallery is what we call larval galleries, these tiny little ones. The eggs hatch, and the larvae feed outward.
If you do have an infested tree, it needs to be removed to prevent the spread of beetles to other trees in the area.
There's one generation a year. So a tree that is standing dead in June, you have time to remove it. Beetles typically fly from July through, say, early September, weather dependent. So if you get the trees removed and properly disposed of before the next generation, then that's the way to do it. So you can do it in the winter. Trees that are attacked now that aren't showing red needles, that just show the pitch tubes on them, you have till next summer to get rid of those, because there are beetles in the tree, but they're not going to be flying until next June or July.
It is possible to save urban trees that haven't been attacked. There are chemical sprays and pheromone packets available that can prevent a healthy tree from becoming infested.
And the spray is extremely effective if it's supplied properly, and that's why I always recommend landowners get a professional applicator, because application method is the most important thing. But there are quite a few different sprays that can be put on trees, and they can be nearly 100% effective in deterring the beetles from impacting the tree, from attacking the trees. There are also some preventive pheromones. Pheromones are a chemical message that the beetles use to communicate with each other, and once the trees become too full of beetles, they switch on a no vacancy signal. You can buy a mimic of that no vacancy signal and staple it to your tree, and it essentially tells the beetles that the tree is already full. Those are very effective on very small scales.
The mountain pine beetle is a part of the Montana landscape and history. But the size and magnitude of the current situation presents new consequences.
This epidemic that we're dealing with is different than the past, I believe, because for one thing, we have a lot more people living in these forests. We have a lot more homes, power lines, pipelines, cell towers, microwave towers, those sorts of structures that we place value that are now in the path of this mountain pine beetle epidemic.
When we have all these dead trees, is it this year, next year, or 5 years from now that we have the really dry, hot August with a lot of dry lightning? If you put the climate and the weather together with that pine beetle activity, we're going to have an explosion.
Well, there's two ways that it increases the fire danger. One is the red needles, and it can move faster. It's much more available to burn than the green needles that tend to have some moisture in them. So that's the first stage of the process. Now, after a few years, the needles fall off, and you actually see the fire danger drop for a period of time. But then the trees fall over, and now you have pretty high fuel loading, and the larger diameter trees that are laying on the ground. And then if you get a dry summer, and those fuels are dried out, then you can get really intense wildfires that create a different type of fire problem, but nonetheless represent a significant fire risk out into the future.
You now have a high BTU fire that's low. You know that's going to be a very high intensity fire. So while it may be true that our risk of crown fire lessens for a short period of time, the graph goes right back up as this stuff falls and becomes that ignition bed.
While there are numerous benefits to fire, large amounts of material burning close to the ground could harm the soil, negating positive effects. The consequences go beyond fire.
There's a major change across the landscape, and people are used to seeing green trees. And they're going to still see some green trees, but certainly not the way the forest looked throughout their lives, really. And that's going to be something that's going to be here probably for at least the next 30 to 40 years until the new stands regenerate and those larger trees come up and become more visible and more like the forest that they've seen in the past. But certainly it affects, you know, people love their national forests, they love trees, they want to see green trees. And it's a big change, and it's difficult for people. I talk to people that or experience it where they live, and it's saying in some cases it brings people to tears, literally. It's heartbreaking for them to see their trees die.
That is it. What's the name of this video? Oh, it was on PBS, and it was called Montana. Let's see. I think it says Montana Focus. Montana Focus, Red and Dead, Montana's Pine Beetle Infestation. And it's been on PBS a number of times in October and in this month too. So what I'd like to do at this point in time is basically I'll ask a couple of questions to get started of our panelists here. But I'm sure you all have questions that you want to ask our panelists, and we've got sheets of paper here on the table with pens, so I would like you to go ahead and write your question. And we've got a couple of volunteers, Jan and Andrea, and we'll go around and just raise your hand, shake your hand, do something, and they'll collect it and bring it up to me, and I'll read it for the panelists to answer. So to start this, I'm believing that it's important to know what creature we're dealing with here, what the infestation really entails, and I think the entomologist is the one to maybe answer this. And what are we dealing with here initially?
No, you can answer that.
Well, I'd start out by saying, first I want to dispel the notion that this is an unprecedented event. It's not. Mountain pine beetle is a native insect. It's been here longer than we have and will be here long after we're gone. It's not cyclic in nature at all, but it's tied very much to its host. Somebody in the video mentioned when stands become susceptible at a certain age. Typically that age in lodgepole pine is 80 to 90 years of age. In ponderosa pine it's probably a little bit longer than that because it's a longer lived species, but very much tied to stand conditions. When stands become either stressed because of old age, or stressed because of overstocking, or stressed because of drought conditions, or some other factor that may introduce stress into those hosts, the beetles have a very keen ability to detect that stress in their host. They have very sensitive chemical receptors in their antennae, and when they're out flying around in the middle of the summer, as somebody mentioned in the video, they fly from about the middle of July to the end of August, early part of September. And when they're out, the female predominantly is making the initial attack, and she's flying through the woods, and she picks up these weak tree signals. Essentially, a stressed tree puts out an entirely different chemical signal than a healthy tree does. And so the beetles are very much able to detect that, and through a series of pheromone communication systems, once an initial beetle or a few initial female beetles find a tree that's susceptible, she starts putting out a pheromone complex that attracts many beetles. Maybe in a 10-inch lodgepole pine, for example, there may be 1,500 beetles attack that individual tree. So they have a very interesting and very kind of complex and a very efficient method of being attracted to their host. And once that many beetles attack an individual tree, the tree just can't, even if it's slightly vigorous enough to stay alive anyway, it just can't overcome that kind of attack. I mean, that kind of pressure. It's like if we were stabbed with 1,000 little pinpricks, we'd eventually bleed to death. That's essentially the same thing happens to a tree. They can't defend themselves against that many attacks. And so that's how they attack their host. After a while, the male beetles, for the most part, produce an anti-attractant pheromone. That was mentioned, I think Amy mentioned that in the video, that we've been able to take advantage of. But that's another kind of different side. But anyway, they have the ability to not only attract beetles to a tree, but they have the ability to turn off attacks on an individual tree. And so that's why we get the group attacks that we do, because of their efficient pheromone communication system. So anyway, they've been around for a long time. We had a bigger outbreak than this one. I think a lot of people don't realize that, but in 1981, we actually had 2.5 million acres infested in northern Idaho, western Montana, which is what we call the northern region in the Forest Service. Right now, we're getting close to that now. We're about 2.3 million acres last year. But again, we're still not as big as the outbreak was 25, 26 years ago. And people have just kind of forgotten that, or maybe they weren't around and realized that. But mountain pine beetle does, in fact, react to warmer, drier conditions. I'm not one of those who gets on the global warming soapbox. But they certainly, as warmer conditions put a stress on their host, drought conditions, or the ability of the beetle to survive better because of milder temperatures, particularly in the winter, they'll do better. Population will maintain themselves at high levels, and it's easier for outbreaks to develop. And so we're in an outbreak situation right now. It's based largely on the fact that there's a lot of hosts around. If there weren't hosts here to feed this outbreak, it wouldn't last very long. But right now, they have a lot of hosts right now. There's a lot of lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine is probably its preferred host in this part of the northern Rocky Mountains where this outbreak is going on right now. I think probably everybody's heard of what's going on in Colorado and up in British Columbia, vast amounts of lodgepole pine. In fact, early in my career, we kind of joked about, we didn't have a mountain pine beetle problem, we had an outbreak of lodgepole pine. And that's really where we are. We have too many hosts. Somebody in the video mentioned that stands are much more densely stocked than they used to be. Back in the days before European settlement, fires broke up these stands. We had smaller areas of susceptible host species, particularly lodgepole pine, at any one given point in time. Now with fire suppression, and we don't log as much as we used to, and that's a whole different thing we don't need to get into right now. But that just, the fact remains that today in 2009 we have a lot more trees susceptible to host on the landscape than we did historically. And even back in the previous outbreak, which was bigger in the early 80s, we responded to that a little bit better. It didn't last quite as long. It got huge, but we were able to remove infested trees and susceptible stands, and we can do that very effectively. We can reduce beetle-caused mortality effectively through silvicultural manipulations. But anyway, that's where we are now. We are in an outbreak situation. A lot of things have come together. It's almost like you can look at it as a fire situation almost, where you have to have the right amount of material to burn and the temperature to burn and the ignition source. Well, right now we have those three things for a mountain pine beetle outbreak. We've got a lot of hosts. We have warm conditions, which have increased their ability to survive, and we have the beetles here present building and taking advantage of the situation. So we're in kind of a perfect storm situation where beetles have been able to take advantage of a lot of hosts, and there's populations that have survived because of the weather. So that's where we are today.
Okay, I guess my next question, please do circulate. Next question would be about the hosts, and maybe some tree experts here. I don't know, Dan, if you want to answer this, or someone. Eric.
Yeah, I could.
What is the condition of our host? What is it going to look like in the near future? What are we going to be dealing with?
Well, the host is.
Can they use the microphone?
Oh, this microphone is not for us. It's just for MCAT to pick up. No,
I'll try to speak up.
Some of them are hard.
Okay.
The host is pine, ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine they like the most. And some ornamental pines that are around here, Scotch pine and so forth, they seem to succumb to it quite easily as well. And on a grand scale, the forest is reached about just prime, because we're about 90 years from the 1910 fire, 100 years now, from the 1910 fires, and they did a lot of logging at the turn of the century, and they started putting out fires at that time. So there's a whole lot of trees. A great part of the population started within a 20-year period, and now they're just reaching the prime age. And so the beetles just, they have hosts everywhere, and they get into the cities, and they're all over the forest. I'm sure you've seen Helena. Helena, they've gotten so high, they gotten into the ponderosa pine all over the town and so forth. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. What do you have any idea of what it might look like for us here in Missoula? Of course, I'm concerned about the rattlesnake, but all of Missoula, the entire local area here.
Missoula's,
what are we dealing with in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years?
Missoula's relatively lucky because we have such a mix of species. We have Douglas fir that they don't hit, larch that they don't hit, and spruce. Other insects and beetles will hit those, but they're not a problem at this point in time. So after the trees turn red and then the needles fall off, and if you have a mix of species up there, it's not quite so obvious anymore. So it's not going to be like the end of the world, where if it was solid lodgepole, it can be extremely catastrophic. That's what happened in Yellowstone, for example. They had all the same species of tree over almost the whole ecosystem of Yellowstone, and they all got ripe at the same time and died of beetles at the same time. They started falling over, and it was a mess. And fire got in there, and of course, it was a fuel situation they couldn't deal with. They couldn't handle the fires in there, so it all burned up. And it's not like it hasn't happened before, because it was all the same aged pines that were there. They all started from huge fires in the past. So it's just basically nature taking its course, and nature can be a real rough manager and take her time doing it too.
It's interesting, actually, if you go up on Mount Jumbo, you can see what Eric's talking about with this fire suppression and the change in species. You can, and I probably shouldn't recommend going off trail at all, but if you were to look far off trail, you could see that there's a lot of large overstory pine scattered about, but then there's a whole understory of young ponderosa and young Doug fir that's grown on underneath. So you can actually just look at the landscape on Jumbo and see what's happened in forests as well. And in a lot of those younger pine stands is where we're seeing a lot of mountain pine beetle activity in those smaller diameter trees. So it's kind of interesting. Don't go off trail, but take a good hard look. You can see it.
So ponderosa is really being hit here.
It is, down the valley bottom. When you get higher in the mountains, you get more lodgepole, and that's the tree that's primarily being hit. But down in the valleys, you know, it's off-site for lodgepole, and it's right on-site for ponderosa pine. So
as I drive up here in the Rattlesnake, you know, all from the base of Mount Jumbo all the way up into the rec area, I'm seeing big sections of ponderosa pine, you know, going now. Now, is this going to continue with the ponderosa? I mean, is this just going to be an ongoing thing with the ponderosa?
it probably will. Yeah, they tend to hit groups. They tend to hit clumps of trees. And on the hillside, you'll see a red clump over here and a red clump over there. And so often I'm going to a clump of trees and I'm looking around at the outside of seeing, now where did these beetles move to? Did they go to the next trees around there? And they almost never do. It's acres away. They'll hit another clump. So if you happen to have a clump of trees on your property, it's not guaranteed that those beetles are going to come out of that clump and hit another clump on your property. They'll probably go into your neighbor's property. And And the beetles in your neighbor's property are the ones that are going to hit your property, so it's very hard to predict. But they do move around. They can fly quite far. They do hit clumps, and the clumps tend to be very, very scattered. And they usually don't hit very young trees. And in ponderosa pine, they don't as often hit very old trees either. So it will work out in the end. You just need to be as patient as Mother Nature. So good luck.
So what you're suggesting is that some of the ponderosa will survive this?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
I might just add, and I certainly agree with everything he said, that just yesterday I was in the rattlesnake area and I put in a set of what we call evaluation plots. It covered about just a transect along about half a mile to that lower elevation ponderosa pine. And, you know, like you mentioned, you can certainly see clumps of trees that have been hit here and there. But we're really lucky, as already been pointed out, because we don't have the lodgepole pine, at least not right down here in town. That's what's been damaging around Butte and Helena the last decade. Almost 10 years ago when I started in Butte, and then the last few years around Helena. We got so much lodgepole pine, which the beetle actually prefers. But in this lower elevation ponderosa pine, just to follow up on what I was saying about where I found yesterday, in this set of plots that I just took some measurements and did some calculations, there are average 2 trees per acre of trees that have been infested in 2009. There were almost 11 trees per acre that were hit last year. So at least in the area that I looked at, I'm not suggesting that's the way it is every place, because I think this outbreak is going to last for a little while. But I don't think it's going to get near as extensive in our ponderosa pine as it did in the ponderosa pine around Helena, because we just don't have the lodgepole, which it really takes a lodgepole pine stand to maintain those mountain pine beetle populations. They'll certainly be attracted to and kill ponderosa pine, but they don't like it as well, and they don't do as well. And this gentleman mentioned they really don't like the great big old growth trees very much. They'll kill those on rare occasions, but they're mostly looking for these smaller diameter and the densely stocked clumps, like Amy mentioned. That's what you can see underneath these large old growth ponderosa pines, these densely stocked stands of mid-range diameter. That's where the beetles are taking those out. In an ecological sense, you can say they're doing us a favor, actually. They don't belong.
And thin stands tend to be more resistant for several reasons. If there's a distance between the trees, the air can move through it more, the breezes, and it messes them up. It sends the pheromones go all over the place. So they don't like that, and they don't particularly like direct sun for any length of time during the day on the barks of the trees. So you'll go into some stands that have been thinned in the past, and if they're wide enough, you'll hardly see any beetle-killed trees. Instead of a clump of trees, the clump ends up being one tree. And it's one tree here and one tree there, and it's quite natural looking. It doesn't look disastrous at all anymore. So a lot of people are reluctant to thin their trees and open the stand up for various reasons. But doing that has proven to be effective in most instances. You can see unthinned stands where they're dense and tight and stressed, and there'll be clumps of trees that are hit there, and you'll see a thin stand next to it, and there'll just be a tree here and a tree there. So, but it has to be relatively wide. I mean, they have to be 20 to 30 feet between trees for that really to come about.
Oh, that is a distance.
Yeah, it is.
You don't see that up here.
So.
And you're really talking ponderosa pine.
Ponderosa pine, that's what I'm talking, ponderosa. Yeah. No, if you were to do that with lodgepole, they'd probably blow over.
Yeah. Right. Here.
Let's see, let me go ahead and read some. People cutting firewood can transport the beetles. What should those people do? Who wants to handle that?
Amy can.
Go ahead, Amy.
Well, and you should pipe in about what the firewood permitting is. But a lot of times people are cutting trees for firewood that have been dead for a while, and the beetles have long since left. There are other insects in that firewood that could emerge, especially those Sawyer beetles that have the long antennae. While those are impressive and pretty interesting insects, those are not the mountain pine beetle. But generally speaking, mountain pine beetle has left the tree usually by the time people are cutting it for firewood. If there's doubt, it's really important to peel back the bark and identify whether or not there are larvae or adults in those galleries. And there's lots of information and resources to learn how to identify that. And a lot of times too, if the bark is taken off, you don't have to worry about it because the beetles won't be able to survive without the insulating layer of the bark as well. And I've talked to quite a few landowners who've sent their wood through a hydraulic splitter and say that the bark comes right off, and some really energetic landowners have peeled the bark off their trees, and that'll work as well too. Or if you do have infested firewood, you can burn it without seasoning it. I don't know how well that burns. I don't know what that means about how often you have to clean your chimney, but I've talked to quite a few landowners who do that as well. So you can burn that wood before the beetles fly the next year.
Amy, if the canopy is red and the tree has been dead for probably, I mean, notably dead for 6 months to a year, they've already flown. Isn't that true?
Yeah, generally speaking. Although I always find it a little bit tricky if you're going to cut firewood like around end of May and June. I would definitely peel back the bark and look for the larvae. But if you're looking at red dead trees, say even August, you can be pretty sure that those beetles have flown and it's safe.
How long would they be after cambium have died in the tree? They'd be gone, wouldn't they? I mean, there's nothing to eat.
They're only in the tree for 1 year.
Yeah.
So yeah, they'd be gone.
The eggs are laid in the middle of the summer. By about the next 1st of July, they leave the tree. So you're right. Once the trees are good and red, color of this folder, they're gone.
Here's a follow-up question to this timing of when they're in the trees and when they fly.
Excuse me, could you make sure you speak loud enough? There's a lot of people kind of stretching to try and...
Okay, yeah, here's a follow-up question. How can you tell if the beetles are in the trees before the popcorn and sawdust are showing? Can you kill the bugs in down trees, segments? But how can you tell even before, or can you tell right when they enter it?
The best way is by looking for the boring dust. Look like sawdust down on the base of the tree. Quite often you'll see these pitch tubes that Amy pointed out in the video, but not always. In a dry year you might not see many of those pitch tubes. But the real telltale sign is to look for boring dust around the base of the tree. If the boring dust is significantly noticeable around the base of the tree or in the bark crevices down the lower part of the bowl, that tree has been sufficiently infested that it cannot be saved. It's going to die. There's not a real good way to kill beetles developing beetles in a tree. There used to be a chemical called lindane that was on the market. It no longer is. It would penetrate the bark and kill the developing brood. Right now we don't have a chemical to use that, and I don't think most of us would recommend doing that if you could. The best thing to do by far, if you have any doubt at all, just what Amy said, remove the bark. A little labor intensive, but it works very effectively.
Okay.
Mary Louise.
Yes. So if we're not going to remove the trees and just let the dead stands on our property, it's sounding like that's a choice too, just to let them stand dead. I guess my question is, if most of us do that, to the two fire experts here, are we looking at fire danger down the road? Is this something we need to attend to, or can we just let it go?
Well, you talk about individual trees around the house.
Well, clumps on hillsides and yards. I mean, some of us up here have pretty heavy infestation.
Yeah, from a fire danger standpoint, isolated clumps here and there, I wouldn't be so concerned about personally. I'd be more concerned about the hazard of the trees falling, tipping over, because those things generally, because they're not fire scarred at the base, because they're not fire scarred at the base, like pine typically have been in the past before we started suppressing fires. Therefore, the root systems will tend to rot out and the trees are more susceptible and fall over. And you'll see that if you've been walking up in the Rattlesnake here, up in the areas where we did some thinning up in Sawmill. Before we got in there was a lot of beetle activity up there at that time, and a lot of the smaller diameter pine trees were just tipping over that had been infested, a couple of years previously. So that would be the biggest concern I have.
And pine do rot, like he said, very, very quickly at the base, and they'll fall over just after a couple of years, especially if you live in a windy area. And then you're going to have a fuel problem on the ground later on. The other thing to think about is where are those trees in relation to your values at risk? Will they fall over if you're going to just leave them there and just have a snag, will they threaten falling over on your house or a shed or a power line or something like that? So you gotta really pay attention to where those trees are. If they're way up in the wildland, if you own, say, 30 acres, and they're way up on the hillside, it may not be a problem for you. But you got to be thinking about those things.
Let me just add that, and also reinforce the idea of hazard trees being the #1 problem, particularly the trees that you've wanted to keep around your house. And with regard to home ignitions during a wildfire, largely the beetle kill does not increase the ignition hazard to your house. What we're finding is that the dead trees actually don't produce higher intensities or more branding than you get from active crown fire in live trees, interestingly enough. There may be a slight increase with the susceptibility of producing crown fire, but once the crown fire has actually established, there's very little difference between the live canopy and the dead canopy. So what that means is that you've still got the same opportunities to keep your house from igniting from beetle kill as you do from live trees. So once again, it's most important to look at those dead trees as a falling hazard.
Okay, we've got.
I was going to add one more thing too. The other thing to think about is the potential value of that tree before it ends up being a snag. You know, there is some value in that tree potentially too. And if you have a large-scale infestation on your property, that's something that you might want to think about doing, is actually getting a value out of that in the process.
What do you mean by value? Logging them?
Potentially.
I thought that the market was totally full in Montana from beetle-killed trees.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much of a market right now. Yeah. But,
so where's the value?
Well, it just depends on the location and logistics of the stand itself. And the other thing in question would be what the value of the market rate is for it. And logistically speaking, is it worth the effort? There's a lot of factors and variables that you have to put in consideration.
And the market changes, so can hope for that.
I would guess
no promise.
I would guess your highest value for that tree, particularly around your house, is the landscaping value, the ambiance value. And so from my perspective, trying to maintain the trees in the immediate vicinity of your house that you want for that ambiance is probably your most important value.
Okay, a couple of questions. We've got some themes going here, so I'm going to try to hit them all pretty quickly. One thing is just about the trees themselves. How can I strengthen my ponderosa pines? And can you, well, that's #1. How can I strengthen my pines, my ponderosa pines? Can you do that? Keep them healthy?
Watering wouldn't hurt. I don't know how much good it would do, and you could overdo that as well. So I don't know any way to and I'm no expert on fertilization either. So.
And I think another thing that you can do to strengthen them is do some thinning in the stand that is overstocked to increase the vigor in those trees, to make them more healthy so they can withstand insect attacks, and they're wider spaced. Ponderosa pine is historically a wide spaced tree. Fire kept those stands thinned out down here in the lower elevations. Historically, in a lot of lower elevations here, fire played a role in thinning those stands out and keeping ladder fuels down, and you'd have parks of very large trees in the lower elevations. Fire would revisit those before we were here every 15, 20 years and underburn those stands. But because of fire suppression and a lot of other factors, the stands are overgrown. So I think the best thing you can do to strengthen those trees is water them and to thin them. and that increases the vigor.
I think one thing we don't realize, at least many of us don't, we only get about 13 inches of precipitation here in a year, and that's not a lot of precipitation. As this gentleman mentioned, historically there might have been 20, 30 trees per acre. Now we may have 200 trees per acre. There's just not enough water and nutrients to go around for all those trees, and that's why they're in this declining state of vigor that they're in, and why beetles take advantage of that. They really do.
And ponderosa pine is a shade intolerant species. It can't stand a lot of shade, so you may have noticed when they're even remotely close together, they start losing all their lower branches. They just from overshading, and pretty soon the tree loses more and more and more, and then you just have a tall tree with a little small top. Well, that's a tree that really ought to go. You'd help everything. You'd make the other trees more vigorous by removing that, create more space to make it more beetle resistant and so forth. So you always want to leave your best trees, and if there are other trees that aren't doing much good, don't look that good near them, it would really benefit the best tree to get those out of the way and just let the other one go. That's a good way of helping your good trees.
Can you effectively treat an already infected tree?
No.
Nope, can't.
Quick question.
Okay, Brookside has Italian and Austrian pine, about 20 years old. Are they susceptible?
I believe they are.
Yeah.
Here.
As long as they're bigger than 5 inches in diameter. I mean, if they're little, small little trees, then they're not as susceptible as having a little bit bigger diameter.
So what's that, which the answers? How many inches?
Like, were they just planted? How
20
big?
year old.
Oh yeah, they're susceptible.
Susceptible, yeah. Okay, we have a slew of questions on the preventative, or the pesticides, basically. Someone's interested in the pheromone packets too, where they get them and all of that. Do you know where they can look at the pheromones?
Yeah, there's 2 places in British Columbia that sell the pheromone package. As a coincidence would have it, the only 2 manufacturers currently in business are both in British Columbia. One is called Synergy Semiochemicals, and the other is called Contec Incorporated. They sell the pheromone packets for roughly, it depends on how many you buy. The highest I've seen is $15 a piece, but you can normally, if you buy them in quantity, you can normally get them for $6 or $7, $8 a piece. But anyway, they work relatively well. They're certainly not as good as treating them with carbaryl. Amy mentioned that in the video. Certainly carbaryl is the best carbaryl insecticide, also called Sevin. It's a very common garden variety insecticide that is available almost everywhere. It works really, really well. You have to get it applied properly and to a sufficient height. But given it's applied properly, it will very effectively, like 100%, protect your trees. The verbenone pouches, the anti-attractant pheromones, more like 80% effective. They're just not as good. I personally think we don't have the complete answer on the anti-aggregation complex for mountain pine beetle, but pheromones work. If you can't spray, you choose not to spray for whatever reason. The pheromones aren't a bad way to go, but they're not as good as the insecticide spray.
I'd like to add. Yeah, and actually we have a website that has a link to where you can get a lot of the information we're saying, so you don't even have to take notes. It's all on the website, really. But can I add a couple things on the insecticide? The garden variety insecticide may not be labeled for mountain pine beetle. It's really important you get the correct material. And there are a couple things. There's carbaryl chemicals. There's also Astro and Onyx. And as I said in the video, and I strongly believe, it's best to have a certified applicator apply these insecticides. I hold a license for pesticides. I would not spray my own trees because they're so much more effective if they're done correctly. You have to have really specialized equipment. You have to make sure you mix it exactly right, get it up on top of the tree, and really it's not that much more expensive to hire somebody who knows what they're doing.
What is the website?
I'll write it right now.
Would you?
Yeah.
And that spray is not like a light mist or anything. It's high pressure hose that can reach up 60 feet up into the tree. So it's a pretty mean machine that sprays up there. And you have to soak the whole thing till it's just running off.
Is that an annual spray? You have to do it once a year or what?
Once every other year.
Yeah,
Well, it depends on the chemical.
Yeah, the carbaryl will get 2 years protection with a single application if it's done properly. The others that Amy mentioned, the pyrethroids, they're only good for 1 year. So you do have to treat those every year.
Beetles.mt.gov.
Does that help?
Is there a certain time of the year that you spray?
Spray it in June. They have to be applied in, beetle flight takes place about the middle of July. We recommend having the sprays on by early in June.
How about the pheromone?
Same thing.
And what about a lot of those pheromone packs too? If we're getting multiple flights, they suggest doing 2 applications.
No, I don't think it's
One's
necessary.
usually good.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary.
The trick is to get it put up just as soon as you can before the first flight,
Right.
Now,
and not too early.
does this take a specialist
No.
to do
No.
this?
No, that's very easy.
And if you have questions, you can always call your local service forester.
That's me.
Oh, Eric Norris.
Are all packets created equal?
There's only 2 companies, and they're both pretty similar.
Yeah.
One's has a little bit more chemical in it, but they both last for the flight season of the Beetle.
Will you explain what multiple flights meant in the implication?
Well, actually, there isn't any such thing as a multiple flight in that we have multiple generations of mountain pine beetle. We sometimes do get re-emerging females. If the summer drags on a little like it did this year, warm September, the females will emerge and attack the second tree. That's where we get the appearance of a second flight, but the beetles don't complete their development and have a whole new flight. At least not the mountain pine beetle. Some bark beetles do, but mountain pine beetle does not.
It's like there's some late bloomers in a tree. If you were to cut into a tree, you'd see some older ones and younger ones and middle-aged ones, and they're just not all on the same cycle. And so some just mature a little bit later than others did, and they fly off.
Well, I have a number of questions here on the spray, on the pesticides themselves, and it sounds like there are a number of pesticides, but there's concern here, effect on birds, spray effect, killing the beetles, but what other species are affected by this pesticide? Is it safe for humans? The brochure suggests using carbo. When should that be applied? We already saw that. Is it effective? And so just how safe is this?
One of the things to be concerned about when you're using, well, any insecticide really, but when you're using carbaryl, onyx, or astro, is its impact, especially carbaryl's impact on honeybees. And it's really important to time the spraying correctly. Again, that's why I recommend hiring a certified applicator, because they take these things into account. Also, you can't spray them too close to water, so if you're right along Rattlesnake Creek and you've got this great ponderosa pine that you want to spray, there is a certain limit, and it's on the label about how close you can get to water, because it can kill aquatic invertebrates, those like stoneflies and caddisflies and mayflies. So you have to keep that into consideration.
Any effects on birds?
No.
Not that we know of. They're really, all the chemicals that have been registered for these preventive use are really quite safe. There are insecticides, and I certainly echo what Amy said, but used properly, there really aren't too many in non-target environmental consequences.
And you can find the labels easily online. If you need some help finding a label for an insecticide, let me know, and I have them all. But they list very clearly all the trials and the lethal doses and the impact on non-target organisms.
And some can sting.
I work with Audubon, and we try to do research on this chemical and its impacts, and there's not a lot of studies done.
Not too many.
So whether there's impacts, it's really an unknown question in the research that we do on it. And I think that's just important to note. Clearly, if you have snags near your home, that's your consideration, but a lot of these snags are really valuable wildlife snags.
Oh, sure.
Or birds, they all see cavities and things. And so if you're in a place and you have individual snags and they're not going to knock over power lines or homes or something, you can consider the wildlife benefits.
And the bigger and older the tree is, the better that it will be, a better snag it will be. Do some of those stain houses, the sprays?
Oh yeah, and carbaryl can have some negative effects. And again, research the chemical before you use it or before you have an applicator use it. But carbaryl can stain houses and decks and cars, and it has to be scrubbed off. And again, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about chemicals, but one of them does, yes.
Okay. Advice to tree owners on or next to the saddle is or was that we want a monocultural of ponderosa. That Douglas firs are an invasive species, get rid of them. Is that advice now changing?
I'm not answering that.
I don't know who was giving the advice.
Actually, the more diverse a forest is, the healthier it is. It may or may not be natural on a grand, scale in history, but if there's Douglas fir up there now, there probably was Douglas fir up there in the past. And the fires, in fact, Douglas fir always have been around, but it's just that the ponderosa pine and the larch have always won the race with when it comes to fire. They just happened to kill more Douglas fir than the other species, and so they just lucked out and survived. It's not that they're better in any way, it's just that given fire in the environment, those ponderosa pine and particularly larch just happened to survive better, and that's why you had more numbers of those than the fir.
So we should encourage diversity.
Yes.
All right, now people are getting into needing help here and wanting help. How can people get help with the cost of the debris removal? It's very pricey. Can you identify resources for property owners to have assessments done? Suggested courses of action to take? And are there federal, county, state, local government employees that can provide these services? How to find qualified private businesses to assist landowners with the health and removal of these trees. Dan, you want to hit this one?
Sure. Well, currently this year we've been pretty busy with a lot of grant cost share projects. In the process, I believe Byron, Bonnie, and Eric, these guys have been involved in bringing homeowners up to snuff with the availability of the grants out there and in which the homeowners can apply for in that process. And then from there, you're looking at having private contractors come in and submit bids to do the project, remove the understory, do the full fuel mitigation process. And that's what we specialize in. We're not really into logging or harvesting, but we're looking at removing the ladder fuels, thinning out the stand, keeping the diversity in that process. And I mean, that's kind of the process at this point right now, the way it's been going. I don't know, you've got to be pretty quick and on the ball doing the application process because the funding does run out. It seems like towards the end of the year, correct?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the grant funding program here. I work for Bitterroot Resource Conservation and Development. It's a private nonprofit. We handle grant money that comes down from the Forest Service and the state of Montana DNRC. And what we do is we have a cadre of foresters that work for the RC&D. We have one in Sealy. We have 3 of us in Ravalli and Missoula County, other than Sealy, and then one up in Mineral County. Those are the 3 counties we operate in. We do have grant money for around Missoula. We don't have a lot, but we have some. We do have an application process like Dan told you about. The application process is open year-long. And I'll put the website up here where you can access that application if you want. Like I said, we don't have a lot of money available at this point, but we are betting on the come here in the next year. Hopefully we will get some more money, and there are other agencies and other folks that in Missoula County that have applied for grants also. I believe you folks have. The Missoula Rural has applied for a grant or 2 to do this kind of work. So there are folks out there that have grants that can help supplement the costs of doing the thinning out there. Now the grants that we have are 50-50 cost share. So what that means is the landowner is responsible for 50% of the cost, and then the grant would be responsible for 50% of the cost. And we have a whole process that we go through to set a project up. You have to submit an application first, and then we rank that application with the other applications we have, and we determine how high a priority you are on that list. And then if you're high enough priority, you'll get a call. And then we'll come out and we'll work with you to design a project on your property. And the main purpose of these grants is to reduce the fire risk on your property. And along with that, we'll work with you to improve the health of your forest also by doing the thinning and some of the hazard tree removal. Okay? So there are some programs available, and I've got a few applications. I'm going to put them on the table over here before I leave, and then I'll put the website address up here for you before we get out of here. Okay?
What's too small, what's too big?
What's that?
What project would be too small, what project would be too big?
We do like an acre around a home, the defensible space, or we'll go out away from the home and we'll do in the wildland, out away from the home, and then around the home too. So we've done projects as much as, what was Grant Creek, 130 acres, and we've done as little as a half acre around a home. So it all depends on your particular situation and the fire susceptibility of your property, where it lays in relation to the high-risk areas identified in the county wildfire protection plan. If you're outside the high-risk areas, you probably won't get a grant. But if you're inside those high-risk areas, you probably will if there's money available, and you get a hold of us. Okay.
I work for Missoula Rural Fire District, and Byron mentioned that we have also applied for grants. We've been working on a Western State grant, some Title III money that comes from Missoula County, and also some Bureau of Land Management money. The primary focus of all the grants that we've received and work on is that survivable space around homes. We try to work in the area, just the first 100 feet around the home. Our primary focus is to make your home survivable. So if this infestation is influencing that kind of a space, we could be a resource to help with some of that type of a project. Ours is also a 50-50 grant. We work usually from about the second week of June until the last week of August. I have university students that work as my crews. And I had 14 working through this last summer. We work pretty much anywhere in the fire district and in any of the drainages that feed into the Missoula Valley. We've worked quite a lot in the upper Rattlesnake area since about 2002. And it is also a 50-50 grant process. The phone number for the fire district is listed in the book. Jim Lowry, one of your neighbors, has been out knocking on doors for a long time, and he shares information about all of these organizations that does the work, and he also talks some about us. And so that's another point of contact where you could reach us. But we are in the phone book, 549-6172, and ask about fuel mitigation, and we'll help you out if we can. Sir?
What are you talking about as a cost per acre, on an average?
Well, again, our primary work is within 100 feet, out to 300 feet. We try to stay within that 100-foot boundary of the homes and survivable space. And my crews work, a 4-person crew works for 8 hours for $150 a day for it.
And that's split then, or is that the landowner's cost?
That's the landowner cost. The match comes out of the federal grant. We also have a chipper that if you want it chipped and blown back on the property, the chipper will come and work at the same rate for you.
I think with the program that Bill has, because he already has the money and the crew ready to go, it might be a little bit more immediate. You get access to his crew as opposed to Byron's situation.
Yeah.
I know, although you do deal with small pieces, but it seems to me like you're kind of geared up for the multiple landowners.
Our average acreage per project is about 7 acres per project. We'll take on 5-acre pieces very easy. The other thing that we also do is we'll do a prescription around your home We have some general guides that were originally developed by the state of Montana when they talk about 10 feet between crowns of trees and 12-foot to 15-foot pruning, or 1/3 the height of the tree, and those kind of things for their standards around these homes. We do vary that somewhat given the type of stand that you have. As mentioned earlier, and you don't have to worry about it around Missoula, but if you're in lodgepole pine, you can't thin to 10-foot crown spacing. You have to tighten them up. And you also need to tighten up down if you have spruce, because they'll blow over. So we look at each individual project and design the prescription around that particular, what type of timber, what type of ground, what is the terrain, is it accessible, inaccessible. We figure all those things into building a prescription for that particular piece of ground. And our average cost per acre, mainly in the Bitterroot, is probably $800 to $900 an acre. But it depends on the density of the stand. It depends on a lot of factors. Maybe it's inaccessible and you just can't drive up there and drag the wood down. It's on a steep hillside. It may be more expensive. Some of them around homes, they can, if you have to directionally fall or cable trees or top them away from homes, that's going to be a lot more expensive.
And I need to add that also to my piece of the conversation. We do not cut trees that are bigger than 6 inches in diameter.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not. Our mission is primarily to provide survivability of homes when a fire approaches the home.
Another thing I'd like to add to what Byron was talking about as well is the treatment of the slash in the situation. That also is an additional factor for the cost. The hand piling and then coming back. And as a contractor, we don't get paid for that project until it's completed. So if we do a project in June, the burning season ends, well, the 1st of December. So we're finishing up projects in November before we get payment on those. So it's a long process. Just another thing to throw out there.
Okay, there's a whole series here on one theme too I'll get to, but right now some people at Georgetown Lake are clearing all pines from their land, including the uninfected, because it costs less than piecemeal removal. They're spending thousands. Is the removal reasonable, good? Is it a good response to a badly infected area?
Well, it probably costs less because they're taking merchantable wood off, and that the money that you can get selling the larger trees to the mill offsets the removal of all the little unmerchantable stuff. So that's probably why it would be cheaper. It does seem fairly heavy-handed to just go removing it, depending on, if it was 20% of the stand and you removed all the lodgepole, it's very different than if you just have a lodgepole stand and you remove all the lodgepole. So I've seen lots of situations where it's a mixed stand and there's 3 or 4 different species there, and you remove all of the lodgepole, it looks just fine. And so different stands react different ways and look different ways.
I'd like to add to that. Up in Georgetown, in that area, we've been working up there, and some of the areas that are getting hit with the beetles are pretty open and vast at the time. So a lot of times people are taking all the trees around their houses out for fear of them falling over, because there's such an open area there, and they do get a lot of wind in the wintertime too. So some of that's happening, but I know they're being encouraged to harvest as well, just to cover the costs.
If climate change is progressing, can we expect other insect infestations? Spruce or fir beetles, other things?
Possibly.
Well, insects do respond to warmer temperatures, no question about that.
What was that?
Insects do respond to warmer temperatures and drier conditions. It's just good for their survival. So yeah, if in fact it gets warmer, we might have more insect infestation.
Well, here's a number of questions on power company, land, public land. Does the power company have a preservation policy of removing trees adjacent to power lines? Is there a management approach for the trees that die and fall on public lands, especially in consideration of fire? What is, and this one's from Morgan, what is the city planning on doing to keep beetles from the open space coming into adjacent lands? So it's all sort of like power company, public lands, and how it's going to affect everything. Morgan?
Morgan, you can answer them all.
Well, I can't really speak for the power company. I'd imagine they wouldn't want a tree falling on the line. I've seen them do a lot of pruning around town, and I guess they're pretty heavy-handed when they prune. The other part of that question was what happens when trees fall on public lands? Well, I think a lot of it does get to the same issues that Dan and Byron were bringing up. Sometimes accessibility is a real issue, and actually getting to the point where you can remove them. Right now, from the city perspective, we have resources to remove trees that pose a threat, so a liability threat around trailheads, around trails, stuff like that that could fall on cars or people. We don't have resources right now to do massive thinning projects or removals. At the rate we've been going, we've been clearing and actually thinning around 10 to 20 acres a year, and we've got about 250 to 300 acres of forest. So it's kind of a long-term project. We, yeah, a lot of job security there. We have, and I don't know, some of you guys might have read in the paper, Amy and I went up and we were doing some beetle surveys around. We do have quite a bit of infestation in the Jumbo Saddle area, where there are a lot of pine-dominated forests. We do have some pretty unhealthy forests, areas that have been overgrown where fire cycle has been removed. Most of the forests that you see on the west flank of Mount Jumbo, between the L and the Saddle, those are kind of dominated by Douglas fir. There's not as much pine in there, so they're not as susceptible to the beetle problem. They are definitely overstocked, and you know, in some of those areas you can't even put your arms out without hitting a tree on both sides. So you know, from our standpoint, we're definitely exploring options and grant monies, and right now to really start to address this problem. I like to view it as more of a forest health issue. You know, our forests, there's a lot more of these small little kind of trashy trees, and it's just a real shame to go up there and see a little local infestation of beetles that's taken out a little spot of small trees, and then they've hit a big 150-year-old ponderosa pine right next to it. Historically, Mount Jumbo didn't have many forested acres on it at all. It used to burn quite frequently. Pictures from 100 years ago, you hardly see a stick of timber on it. There are still some big trees up there, and that's one thing as our inventories that we're taking right now is we really want to know where those big trees are, because those are kind of legacy trees, and it'd be nice to protect them. But there are a lot of trees that should certainly be thinned out. And, the forest itself should be restored to a healthier state, more natural state.
And I'll speak for the Forest Service. The Lowell National Forest has focused the majority of its restoration projects and vegetation management in the wild land-urban interface. And if you look at some of the projects on this district, the Missoula district, and on the 9 Mile district and Sealy, you'll see some of that. We've got a project that was approved a couple years ago up at Grant Creek. John's gotten some of the work done. We're seeking funding for some of the rest of that work. It's not the whole Grant Creek by means, but it is a good charge. There's a group right now called the Lobo Restoration Committee. Have most of you heard of it? There's a group called the Montana Restoration Committee, which is started by the governor, I'm not sure, a couple years ago, I believe. In a large group. It's a group of agency, industry, conservation, environmental groups that have come together. They've got some subgroups. One of them is called the Lobo Restoration Committee. And that group this last winter was looking for, and what they do is they work with the Forest Service, and they try to advise the Forest Service on projects and try to help us to look at different issues and such. The local Lobo Restoration Committee has identified an area called the Marshall Woods as a potential future project. In fact, I'm gonna be meeting with that group here in a week or two, and we're gonna come out with we're gonna look at developing a public involvement strategy. So you should be hearing about more of this in the next year, in the next 4, 5, 6 months. And in that project, we're gonna be looking at the lands basically up Marshall drainage and Rattlesnake drainage up to about Fraser Creek. That's in the initial pencil drawing area. We haven't identified what the proposals will be at this point. We'll be coming to the public for help with determining what some of those will be. But you know, we understand that the project will likely include fuels reduction, some forest health type projects, and watershed restoration and those kind of things. So it's really early. We haven't really set what our projects will be within that process. The Lolo Restoration Committee is a local group of people representing different agencies, different organizations. And we're going to be working with them closely to come up with a project that we hope the community can support. And like I said, we'll be developing a public involvement process within the few weeks, and that will hopefully, many of you will become members and help us determine what should be done on the Forest Service lands up the Rattlesnake in the next couple of years.
Does prescribed fire have any role in your plan?
Yes, very much so. You know, bringing fire back into the system is where we can do it safely. Is definitely part of the proposals. Where we haven't thought of, you know, we haven't determined yet. John, you probably got a good handle on what are some of the likely candidates. I've heard the Pine Flats up in the NRA. What other areas are likely to be looked at for projects?
For the thinning or burning?
Or both, either one.
Okay, well, yeah, like Paul mentioned, we're gonna be working on this Marshall Woods project, but to give you some perspective, there's been a lot of work that's already been done, starting back in the mid-80s with the North Side Project. Some of you may have heard of that, and that's between the Rattlesnake and Granite Creek, a lot of it, the ground there. And so we got a good start with that. We probably treated 1,500 to 2,000 acres of that. After that project, we did one called the Patty Blue, which was south of Missoula, Patty Canyon, Blue Mountain area. And we really got in there and did a good job of thinning from below and getting some good crown spacing on those acres. So we got a couple more thousand acres on the south side of the town. And now we've come back with the Grant Creek project, which we're implementing now. We've got all the environmental studies that have been done on that, and we're actively implementing that. In fact, this year we thinned and hand piled 400 acres up there, and there's other parts of that project that were approved that we're looking at. We were just talking about it yesterday. In fact, there's going to be a commercial component with some other work that we're going to ask whoever is the successful bidder of that to do some thinning type work up there. So we're going to really be filling in the gaps that we didn't treat with the north side. So we're really working on reducing the basal area up there and kind of featuring the ponderosa pine and getting fire back on the site. Yes?
May I ask, are there places where we could see maps where you're working in these special areas so we can see how they're coming together?
Yeah, I've got one, and I was going to bring it tonight, and I didn't. I'm sorry.
Thanks a lot.
What can we do for preventative? Can we start spraying the trees now before it gets here? What can we do? What's been working?
Well, why don't we go through this step by step? First of all, should everybody be spraying their yards as a preventative measure? No. So what the homeowner needs to know is maybe have an assessment to know what they've got on their property. Who could do that assessment?
Landowners could do that assessment. If you only have a few trees in your yard, you could easily go onto the website and figure out what's infested, what's susceptible. I mean, it's great to hang out with Eric, but you don't necessarily need him to come to your property to look at your trees, because mountain pine beetle is pretty easy to identify. And but if you do need Eric, I volunteer him to come out.
Okay.
Thanks.
So in other words, if you don't know what you're doing, call Eric.
Security,
Once it's diagnosed, then treatment, then spray, right?
Spraying or
Not
remove
necessarily.
trees
Spray or remove them.
yeah,
Oh, well,
yes.
if it's a As if it's a done-in tree, if it's too sick, remove it.
Or
Yeah.
verbenone. You have options, verbenone as well. And these are all listed as well on the website. So you should be able to get pretty far along on your own identification and diagnosis with the website, and then start thinking about the treatment options that are available to you and weighing the pros and cons, because spraying is not a universal answer. Verbenone's not a universal answer.
Keep in mind, however, if it's infested, it doesn't do you any good to use spray or verbenone or anything else. And unfortunately, a tree that was infested, say 2 months ago, will probably have green needles until next May or June. So don't let people fool you into thinking that you can save that tree by treating it with a chemical or something. It's not true.
Generally, if you have beetles on your tree, on your property, you would want to remove the red trees, and you would, during the winter, before next spring, you would want to remove the green trees with the hits and the bark and the boring dust on them. And then putting the pheromone caps or spraying your critical trees. Spraying can be expensive, of course, so can the pheromone caps, but you might want to decide which trees you cannot stand to lose and put your money into that. But removing infected trees, red and green, is a help, a big help.
And if you want to use the pheromones, we strongly recommend you take out the currently infested trees. That will make the likelihood of that pheromone being successful much greater.
Now, Dan, when you go, you can identify the infested trees,
Yeah.
whether they're green or red.
Yes, and some of the properties that we've treated with the thinning projects that we've had on an annual basis, sometimes the homeowners ask us to come back and take a walk through, and we've been able to catch up with and slow down the infestation on their property. Pretty much keep up with it. Identify the trees that are beetle infested or brood trees, take them down, in several instances pile them and then burn them. Even when they're green, we're using propane to burn them, when the conditions are optimal, of course.
One thing to note too, if you thin any stand, you got a lot of trees all together, they're under pretty intense competition. When you take out some and leave the others, it's going to take them a year or two to grow their root systems out to a point where they get that bigger. So there is a little bit of susceptibility there right after any thinning is done. So it is important to go back to the stand and double check and triple check. And that would help.
Okay, you have a question?
Yeah, a couple things. First off, we were kind of talking about spraying. I have some land up by Georgetown Lake, and I've had excellent results with using pheromone packets, especially if there's other, target trees on public lands or anything near your trees. Beetles will often just go on by and look for something that's more available to them. So I encourage y'all to investigate the pheromone packets.
Property, you can leave them there for free, and Johnson Brothers Recycling will chip those. That's that place near the interstate where they just have piles and piles of pallets. And they recycle pallets, and they chip pallets, and they chip anything you could dump there, really.
And if you do have access to a chipper, chipping is another viable option. You can use the mulch for your planting beds or something.
I was just gonna say too, if it's logistically possible, hauling the slash off, you can haul up to 12 inches in diameter to eco, if it's non-infested. So that's generally what we try and do when we're thinning out an understory and ladder fuels.
I think it might be kind of nice just to have like an easy resource for people who maybe have a tree or two that don't own a lot of acreage, that are trying to be good, responsible tree owners, and trying to see where if your neighbor's trees are infested and worried about your trees getting infested. But a suggestion I might put out there is that the extension, the county extension office, did a project for the coddling moth project with pheromone packets. And if there were, I would think if there were enough residents in an area that were having problems, it might be a good way to have them conduct this so-called experiment, because I know that they did it citywide, and it was pretty effective, and they had these requirements. They had to have like 50, fruit trees within a certain area in order for it to work, but it made it very cost-effective for homeowners. So that might be an option you might want to think about pursuing.
And it is with those pheromone packets, and I'm not as familiar with it as some of you guys, but you don't need to tag, if you're hitting a stand or something, you don't need to tag every single tree.
No.
It's a X number of pheromone packs per acre.
Yeah, we recommend 30 per acre if you're looking for some kind of area treatment. We haven't had quite as good a luck with area treatment as we do individual tree protection. For individual tree protection, you got 1 or 2 trees around the house, we recommend 2 pouches per tree. But we can get a reasonably good amount of area protection with 30 pouches per acre. Kind of, that's about a 40-foot spacing.
And if you get the retail contact pack, it says hang them at 6 and 12 feet on individual trees. You don't have to do that. They're eventually going to remove that requirement. So you don't need to get on the ladder. You can just hang them as high as you can reach, and that's fine.
Out of kids' reach.
Yeah.
Barney, I think somebody wants a website for the grants. Do you?
Yeah, I'll put it on the board up here.